Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the cool blue hour before dawn in 9th century Baghdad, where the sky is just beginning to pale and the city still feels like it's holding its breath. You're lying on a simple mattress, the kind that knows your shape a little too well, and somewhere nearby a rooster is making a very confident but slightly premature announcement about the morning. The air smells faintly of dust, river water, and yesterday's cooking fires. You blink awake knowing you have a full day ahead of you, a day spent not with swords or caravans, but with ink, paper, and the slow accumulation of human knowledge. This is the Abbasid Caliphate at its intellectual peak, and you, lucky you, are a librarian. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting excitement every 5 minutes, because today's dangers include paper cuts, smudged ink, and the crushing responsibility of keeping priceless texts in the correct pile. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You rise slowly, because rushing is considered deeply uncivilized at this hour, and because there is no clock glaring at you from a bedside table. Time here is felt, not measured. Outside, Baghdad is still quiet enough that you can hear the Tigris in the distance, a broad, patient presence that has already seen countless mornings like this. The city you live in is young by ancient standards, barely over a century old, yet it already feels dense with ideas. Historians agree that 9th century Baghdad was one of the largest cities in the world, perhaps approaching 1 million inhabitants, though historians still argue whether medieval population estimates like that should be taken literally or as flattering exaggerations by proud chroniclers. You stretch, careful not to knock over the small wooden chest where you keep your personal papers. As a librarian, even your home contains more writing than furniture. You rub your eyes and mentally review the day ahead. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, will need opening, airing, and organizing. Manuscripts copied yesterday must be checked for errors. A visiting scholar from somewhere far to the east is rumored to arrive, bringing a text nobody in the city has seen before. No pressure. Just the collective memory of civilizations resting on your shelves. As you dress, you choose layers suited to a city that will be warm by noon and cool again by evening. Linen brushes against your skin, soft from use. Clothing in Abbasid Baghdad is a quiet language of its own, and while you're not wealthy, your profession grants you a certain respect. Librarians here are not just caretakers of books, they're gatekeepers of knowledge. One mainstream historical fact worth lingering on is that librarians and scholars in Abbasid society were often salaried by the state or wealthy patrons, meaning your job is considered important enough to pay actual money for, which honestly feels like a miracle even by modern standards. You step outside just as the call to prayer begins to ripple across the city. It's not one single voice, but many, overlapping slightly, echoing off walls and rooftops. You pause, letting it wash over you. Even if historians still argue whether the exact melodies and pacing of the adhan sounded the same then as now, the effect is timeless, a gentle cue that the day has officially begun. The street outside your home is narrow and shaded, designed to keep the worst of the sun at bay. Somewhere nearby, a baker is already awake, coaxing flatbread into existence. The smell drifts toward you, and your stomach politely reminds you that you are, in fact, human and not sustained solely by abstract thought. You smile to yourself. Librarians are often stereotyped as pale creatures who subsist on dust and silence, but here you are, very much alive, very much hungry. As you walk, you notice the slow awakening of the city. A donkey brays with the emotional intensity of someone who has been asked to work too early. A neighbor sweeps yesterday's dust from their doorway, pushing it into the street where it will immediately be replaced by today's dust. You pass a water seller adjusting his leather skins, preparing for a long day of shouting his availability at increasingly thirsty people. Baghdad is already doing what it does best, functioning. Your thoughts drift, as they often do in these early moments, to the fragile nature of what you protect. Paper, still a relatively new technology in the Islamic world, has begun replacing parchment and papyrus. This is a quiet revolution you're living through. A quirky tidbit scholars like to mention is that paper technology reached Baghdad from China after the Battle of Talas in the 8th century, though historians still argue whether that story is overly neat and symbolic, rather than a precise account of how knowledge transfer really happened. Either way, paper is cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce, which means more books, more copies, and more chances for ideas to spread, or be miscopied in truly creative ways. You turn a corner and glimpse the distant silhouette of domes and courtyards that mark the intellectual heart of the city. Not yet the House of Wisdom itself, but close enough that your mind begins to shift into work mode. You feel a familiar mix of calm and responsibility. There's something soothing about knowing exactly what your role is. You are not conquering lands or debating theology at court. You are opening doors, sorting texts, and making sure the words of the past survive one more day. A light joke crosses your mind as you walk. Somewhere in the future, people will argue loudly about whether libraries are still relevant, while you are here, centuries earlier, surrounded by proof that civilization tends to collapse the moment nobody knows where the books went. You smirk quietly. Best not to tell the caliph that particular thought. The sky brightens, the streets grow busier, and your pace settles into something unhurried and steady. This is how your day begins, not with drama, but with intention. By the time you reach the outer paths leading toward the great libraries of Baghdad, the city is fully awake, and so are you, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knows that today, once again, knowledge will be handled gently. You begin the morning rituals that quietly separate sleep from scholarship. Before your mind can fully settle on catalog lists and ink levels, your body insists on its own careful routines. You perform your ablutions with cool water drawn from a clay vessel, splashing your face and hands until the last remnants of sleep retreat. The water shocks you just enough to feel awake, but not enough to feel resentful about it. In 9th century Baghdad, cleanliness is not just personal preference, it's woven into religious, social, and intellectual life. Scholars are expected to arrive clean, composed, and alert, because apparently wisdom prefers a tidy container. You dry your hands on a simple cloth and take a breath. The city is louder now, more confident in its existence. Somewhere a vendor is already arguing with a customer, and somewhere else someone is absolutely convinced they are singing beautifully. You adjust your robe and settle onto a low cushion for breakfast, which is refreshingly unpretentious. A piece of flatbread, still warm if you're lucky, a little olive oil, maybe dates or honey if yesterday was generous. There is no rush. Eating too quickly is considered slightly uncouth, and besides, you have learned the hard way that spilled honey on manuscripts later in the day is not a professional look. A mainstream historical fact slips naturally into your thoughts as you eat. The Abbasid world places enormous value on daily routine. Prayer times, meals, study hours, all of it forms a rhythm that keeps the city functioning. Historians often note that this structured daily life allowed scholars to produce an astonishing amount of work without burning out entirely, though historians still argue whether the pace was truly sustainable or if surviving texts simply represent the output of the most tireless individuals. Either way, your own routine feels comforting rather than restrictive. You chew slowly, listening to the sounds filtering in from the street. The bread is slightly chewy, the oil grassy and mild. You think, not for the first time, that future generations will romanticize meals like this as pure and simple, while you would happily accept a few more options on the menu. Still, it does the job. Your stomach settles, and your thoughts grow calmer. Librarians, after all, cannot afford to be hangry. It leads to shelving mistakes, and shelving mistakes lead to chaos. As you finish eating, you rinse your hands again. Water management is an obsession in Baghdad, and for good reason. The city's canals and aqueducts are engineering marvels, carrying life through heat and dust. A quirky tidbit scholars like to mention is that some households add fragrant herbs or flower petals to washing water, not just for cleanliness but for mood. You consider adding something similar someday, then remember you barely remember to replace your reed pens on time. You pause briefly for prayer, joining countless others across the city in a shared moment of stillness. Even if historians still argue over how strictly individuals adhered to prayer schedules in practice, the communal pause is unmistakable. For a few moments, the city exhales. You feel grounded, connected not just to your neighbors but to generations before you who began their days in much the same way. Once finished, you gather a small bundle of personal items. A folded cloth for cleaning your hands, a spare reed pen tucked carefully away, and a thin notebook containing your own observations. Librarians keep notes the way other people keep lucky charms. You glance at the notebook and smile at a margin doodle from yesterday, a very tired-looking camel reading a book upside down. You have no memory of drawing it, which is usually how the best marginal art happens. As you step back outside, the sunlight is strengthened, casting sharp lines across the street. The smells have multiplied: baking bread, animal sweat, fresh herbs, and the ever-present dust. You pull your robe a little closer, more out of habit than necessity. Dressing modestly and practically is expected, especially for someone in your position. Fashion exists, certainly, but librarians are not meant to distract with their clothing. Your job is to draw attention to ideas, not sleeves. You exchange nods with neighbors, brief and familiar. One asks if the rumors are true about a new Greek text arriving soon. You give a noncommittal shrug, the universal scholarly response meaning possibly, eventually, don't quote me. Gossip travels fast in Baghdad, especially when it involves books. A single manuscript can spark weeks of discussion, arguments, and deeply competitive copying efforts. It's oddly comforting to know that even centuries ago, people were still very intense about reading. As you walk, you mentally prepare yourself for the long hours ahead. You will stand, sit, lean, and crouch in equal measure. Your hands will smell faintly of ink by midday, no matter how careful you are. A light joke crosses your mind: if scholars could bottle the scent of ink-stained fingers, they would sell it as essence of productivity. You shake your head, amused by your own nonsense. You think briefly about health. Abbasid medicine is advanced in many ways, with physicians writing detailed treatises on diet, exercise, and balance. Another mainstream historical fact is that scholars often followed medical advice to moderate their work with rest, though historians still argue whether anyone actually followed that advice when a fascinating text was involved. You make a mental note to stretch later. Your back will thank you, even if your curiosity won't. The street opens slightly as you move closer to the institutional heart of the city. You feel ready now, properly awake, fed, clean, and mentally aligned with the quiet seriousness your role requires. These morning rituals are not wasted time, they are preparation. They ease you into a mindset where patience feels natural and precision feels possible. You take one last breath, steady and unhurried. The day has not yet demanded anything of you, and that feels like a small gift. Soon, the shelves and scrolls will claim your attention, but for now, you walk with an easy rhythm, carrying the calm of a morning well begun. You continue on foot, letting the city carry you forward as much as your own steps do. The walk toward the House of Wisdom is never exactly the same twice, even if you take the same streets. Baghdad reshapes itself hourly, As stalls appear, conversations spill into pathways, and animals develop very strong opinions about where they're willing to stand. You navigate it all with the quiet confidence of someone who has memorized these routes the way others memorize prayers. The street widens, then narrows again, shaded by overhanging upper floors. Light falls in long strips, turning dust into something almost beautiful. You pass a bookseller setting out his wares, carefully stacking thin volumes on a low table. He greets you warmly, and you return it with a smile. Booksellers and librarians share a bond, even if they pretend to argue about prices and priorities. A mainstream historical fact slips into your thoughts. Baghdad's book markets are among the most vibrant in the medieval world, with stalls dedicated entirely to poetry, science, theology, or philosophy. Some streets are practically organized by genre, which is either a dream or a nightmare depending on how lost you already are. You pause briefly to glance at a title written in careful script. The seller watches you with hopeful patience. You nod appreciatively, then move on, because buying books before work is how personal collections spiral out of control. You already have enough trouble remembering which manuscripts are yours and which technically belong to the caliph. As you walk, you cross paths with students, some eager, some clearly still half asleep. They clutch tablets, loose pages, or nothing at all, trusting their memories to carry them through the day. You overhear fragments of conversation, arguments about grammar, a joke about a teacher who drones on like a trapped fly, speculation about which patron is funding which scholar this month. The intellectual energy of the city hums softly, not loud or boastful, just constant. You approach a bridge spanning one of the canals feeding off the Tigris. Water moves lazily beneath you, reflecting the sky. Baghdad's layout is intentional, circular in its original design, with the caliph's palace and major institutions at its heart. Historians agree that this urban planning was meant to symbolize order and authority, though historians still argue how closely the lived reality of the city ever matched that idealized geometry. From your perspective, it mostly means you've learned which turns to take to avoid traffic jams caused by stubborn goats. A quirky tidbit comes to mind as you pass a group of laborers repairing a wall. Bricks here are often stamped with marks indicating their source or patron, a subtle form of branding long before anyone thought to trademark it. You've seen similar markings on book chests and shelves. Even knowledge, it seems, likes to know where it came from. The closer you get to the House of Wisdom, the quieter the streets become, not empty, just more deliberate. Voices soften, footsteps slow. It's not enforced by guards or signs, it's cultural gravity. People know they're nearing a place where concentration is currency. You straighten your posture without thinking, as though the building itself expects a certain level of seriousness from you. You pass under an archway and into a courtyard shared by scholars, copyists, and administrators. Trees offer patches of shade, and a small fountain murmurs steadily at the center. You pause here, just for a moment. This is one of your favorite spots in the city, not because it's grand, but because it feels balanced. Water, stone, greenery, and quiet ambition all in one place. You inhale, catching the faint scent of damp stone and ink. A light joke drifts through your mind: if someone wanted to steal a book, this would be the worst place to do it. Everyone here notices everything, and librarians have memories like steel traps when it comes to missing manuscripts. You once identified a borrowed text purely by recognizing a familiar coffee stain on the margin. The borrower never met your eyes again. You greet a guard at the outer entrance with a nod. He knows you well enough not to ask questions. Inside, the building waits, cool and still. The walls hold the temperature better than the streets outside, and you feel an immediate sense of relief. The House of Wisdom is not a single hall, despite how it's often imagined later, but a complex of rooms, storage spaces, and work areas. Historians still argue whether it functioned more as a library, an academy, or a state-sponsored translation bureau. From your perspective, it's all of those things, plus a daily test of your organizational sanity. You step inside and let the door close softly behind you. The sounds of the city fade, replaced by the subtle creaks of wood and stone. Light filters in through high openings, catching dust motes that drift lazily. You feel the familiar shift in your chest, the sense of crossing from ordinary space into something intentionally preserved. You set down your bundle and take a moment to simply stand there. The day's real work hasn't begun yet, but the transition matters. This walk, these sights and sounds, have prepared you. Your pace slows, your thoughts narrow, and your focus sharpens. Whatever waits for you on the shelves today, errors, discoveries, debates, you're ready to meet it calmly. With a practiced hand, you reach for the keys. It's time to open the doors properly, to let knowledge breathe for another day. You turn the key with a familiar, reassuring resistance, the kind that tells you the lock is still doing its job. The wooden doors open inward, releasing a faint, dry scent that only exists where paper, wood, and time share the same air. This is the smell of work ahead. You step inside and pause, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness. Opening the library is not a dramatic act, it's a careful one, full of small gestures that matter more than they seem. Your first task is always the same: wake the room. You move slowly, unfastening shutters and allowing thin bands of morning light to spill across the floor. The beams illuminate shelves, chests, and low desks, revealing a landscape of texts in quiet anticipation. Dust motes float lazily, and you make a mental note to sweep later, knowing full well that dust in Baghdad is undefeated. A mainstream historical fact surfaces naturally. Manuscripts here are often stored in wooden chests or on open shelves, sometimes wrapped in cloth, because bindings are precious and humidity is a constant concern. You begin opening the chests one by one, lifting lids just enough to let air circulate. This is a daily ritual, designed to prevent moisture and pests from settling in too comfortably. You've learned to listen as much as look. A creak that sounds wrong, a hinge that resists, these are clues that something needs attention. Historians still argue how effective these methods were by modern preservation standards, but from experience, you know they make a difference. Fewer warped pages, fewer unwelcome insect surprises. You have learned this the hard way. You straighten a stack of manuscripts left out from yesterday. Someone has placed a philosophical treatise too close to a medical text, which feels like an argument waiting to happen. You gently separate them, murmuring an apology to no one in particular. Organization here is a living thing, constantly adjusted as new texts arrive and old ones are consulted. There is no single universal system, despite how much future librarians might wish otherwise. You work with categories that make sense to the people using them now. As you move, your fingers brush familiar surfaces. Smooth paper, slightly rough parchment, ink that has faded to a soft brown. A quirky tidbit floats into your thoughts. Some scribes add small notes warning future readers not to lick their fingers when turning pages, because certain inks contain minerals that taste terrible or worse. You smile faintly. Even centuries ago, people needed reminders not to eat the books. You check the lamps, trimming wicks and setting them aside for later. Daylight will suffice for now, but evenings require careful planning. Oil is valuable, and smoke can damage manuscripts if you're careless. You've learned to place lamps so light falls across the page without inviting soot. A light joke crosses your mind. The true enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but poorly positioned lighting. Footsteps echo softly as a copyist arrives early, nodding to you in greeting. You return it, already noting how he carries his tools. Confident, but not rushed. Good. Copyists will soon fill the room, each settling into a familiar place. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. Scribes in Abbasid Baghdad often specialize, some copying scientific texts, others poetry or religious works, because familiarity reduces errors. Historians still argue how much specialization actually improved accuracy, but you can tell instantly which copyist should not be trusted with dense mathematics before lunch. You lay out fresh writing surfaces, aligning desks so no one blocks another's light. It's a small thing, but it prevents grumbling later. You place weights on loose pages to keep them from curling. The room begins to feel ready, like a stage before a quiet performance. The hum of potential grows. You pause at a chest containing newly arrived texts. These are always handled last, with a little extra care. You open it slowly and peer inside. The manuscripts are wrapped in cloth, tied neatly. You don't unwrap them yet. That deserves its own moment, perhaps after a cup of water and a clearer head. Patience is part of the job description, even if no one ever wrote it down. As more people arrive, the space fills with soft sounds, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of stools, the gentle clearing of throats. No one speaks loudly. It's understood without being said. You exchange brief words with a colleague about the day's priorities. He mentions a missing commentary that might still be at a scholar's home. You sigh quietly, already planning a polite retrieval. You take one last slow look around. Everything is where it should be, for now. The doors are open, the air is moving, the tools are ready. The library has awakened, and with it, the steady, patient work of preservation and discovery begins again. You settle into the gentle rhythm of handling tools, the small, precise objects that make your entire profession possible. Before anyone asks for a manuscript or begins copying, you check the supplies. You move to a low table where bundles of reed pens are laid out, their tips carefully cut at different angles. You pick one up, testing its balance between your fingers. A good pen feels almost eager, like it wants to be useful. A bad one splutters ink at the worst possible moment, usually onto something irreplaceable. Ink comes next. You lift a small ceramic jar and peer inside. The surface is glossy and dark, reflecting a distorted version of your face. This ink is made from soot mixed with gum arabic and water, a recipe that has proven reliable for centuries. A mainstream historical fact fits naturally here. Carbon-based inks like this are one reason so many medieval manuscripts remain readable today. They sit on the surface of the page rather than eating into it. Historians still argue whether every scribe followed the ideal recipe or adjusted it creatively, which would explain why some pages look pristine while others seem determined to flake apart. You stir the ink gently, inhaling its faint, smoky scent. There's something oddly comforting about it. You think, briefly, that if calm had a smell, it might be this. A light joke crosses your mind. Modern people will one day spend fortunes trying to recreate authentic medieval ink aroma in tiny bottles. Paper is your next concern. You lift a stack and fan it slightly, checking for uniformity. This paper, made from pulped linen and hemp rags, is smoother than parchment and far more forgiving. Its arrival has changed everything. Another mainstream historical fact slips in easily. Abbasid Baghdad becomes one of the first major centers of paper production outside China, helping fuel the explosion of books and learning. Historians still argue whether paper alone caused this intellectual boom or simply arrived at the perfect moment to support it. You set aside sheets with minor imperfections. These will be used for drafts, notes, or students who are still learning to keep their lines straight. Nothing is wasted if you can help it. Even scraps find a purpose. You once saw a grocery list written on the back of an astronomical diagram, and you're still not sure whether that was efficient or deeply unsettling. You check the small tools next: knives for scraping errors, rulers for keeping lines straight, and weights carved from stone or metal to hold pages in place. A quirky tidbit makes you smile: some scribes decorate their page weights with tiny inscriptions or jokes, as if even the tools deserve personality. You turn one over and read a faint phrase scratched into the surface: "Be patient." You snort softly. The tool is clearly judging you. Copyists begin selecting their pens and paper, moving with practiced familiarity. You watch them for a moment, noting posture and grip. A tired hand makes sloppy letters, and sloppy letters create future arguments. You gently remind one scribe to adjust his pen angle. He thanks you, slightly embarrassed. You've learned to correct without humiliating. Knowledge thrives better that way. As the room fills with quiet concentration, you feel the satisfaction of preparation paying off. Everything has its place. The tools are ready, the surface is clean. A light joke flickers through your mind: if chaos ever truly wins, it will start with someone misplacing the ink. You move to your own small desk, where you keep a personal set of tools. They're not better than anyone else's, just familiar. You sharpen a pen carefully, shaving away thin curls of reed. The motion is meditative. Your thoughts drift to debates you've heard among scholars about whether writing tools influence thought itself. Historians still argue whether the ease of writing on paper changed how ideas were structured, encouraging longer works and more experimentation. You glance at the growing stacks of texts around you and suspect the answer is yes. You test your pen with a few strokes on scrap paper. The lines are clean, the ink obedient. Good. You set it down and stretch your fingers. The day is settling into its steady hum. Outside, the city grows louder, but in here, the soundscape is controlled: scratching pens, soft footsteps, the occasional whispered question. You take a sip of water and look around, feeling quietly proud. These tools, so ordinary on their own, are the foundation of something extraordinary. Without them, ideas would remain trapped in minds and conversations, lost to time. With them, they travel centuries. You smile faintly, thinking that your job is less about guarding objects and more about keeping a process alive. Everything is ready. The real work can begin. You turn your attention to the invisible architecture of the library: the catalogs, lists, and mental maps that keep chaos at bay. There is no grand, leather-bound master index waiting on a pedestal. Instead, classification here lives in notebooks, on tags, and mostly in your head. You pull one of your record books closer and flip it open, the pages already soft from use. Inked columns march neatly down the page, listing titles, authors, origins, and locations. Neatness is not vanity, it's survival. A mainstream historical fact settles naturally into your thoughts. Medieval Islamic libraries often organize texts by subject first: law, medicine, astronomy, poetry, then by author, sometimes with regional groupings layered in. It's practical, intuitive, and flexible enough to adapt when a brand new field suddenly appears, as they occasionally do. Historians still argue how standardized these systems were across the Abbasid world, or whether every major library quietly did its own thing while pretending otherwise. You move through the shelves, checking that yesterday's returns have found their way home. You adjust a bundle of mathematical treatises, sliding them a finger's width apart to prevent pressure damage. You glance at a tag tied to one manuscript, its ink faded just enough to require a second look. You rewrite it carefully, tying it back in place. A tiny act, but one that might save someone hours of searching later. As you work, you're aware that classification is not neutral. Deciding where a text belongs subtly shapes how it's read. A philosophical commentary placed among theology invites different questions than one shelved near logic. You consider this as you reposition a book, hesitating before settling it. You smile faintly. Even shelving is a form of interpretation. Future scholars will debate the ideas inside, you're debating where it lives. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you recall a colleague's complaint from last week. Some manuscripts arrive with multiple titles depending on who copied them or where they came from. One text alone might be known by 3 names, each perfectly reasonable. You've learned to cross-reference aggressively. A light joke crosses your mind. Authors may dream of immortality, but librarians dream of consistent naming conventions. You stop at a chest containing translations, a particularly lively section. Greek works and Arabic scripts sit beside Persian histories and Indian mathematical texts. This is where the House of Wisdom feels most alive. Another mainstream historical fact fits easily here. Abbasid Baghdad is a center for translation, especially under caliphs who actively sponsor the movement. Historians still argue whether this patronage is driven more by genuine curiosity or political prestige. From where you stand, the motivation matters less than the result. You make a note about a translation that needs relabeling. The translator has added commentary in the margins, blurring the line between original and interpretation. You consider whether it should be classified as a new work entirely. You jot a question mark beside the entry. Some decisions can wait. The best catalogs are living documents, not frozen judgments. A scholar approaches quietly, asking for a medical text referenced in a poem he's studying. You suppress the urge to blink in confusion and instead nod thoughtfully. You retrieve the manuscript, explaining where it sits in the catalog and why. He thanks you, impressed. Moments like this are small victories. When the system works, it feels almost magical. You return to your desk and update your record book, careful to keep your script legible. Your handwriting is not beautiful, but it's consistent, which is arguably more important. You think briefly about how future historians will reconstruct entire intellectual networks based on records like these. Historians still argue how complete such records ever were, and you quietly hope your own notes survive long enough to confuse someone centuries from now. As the morning progresses, the library settles into a deeper silence. Pens scratch steadily, pages turn softly. You feel the calm satisfaction of order maintained, at least for now. Classification is never finished, it's a task that resets itself every day. But for this moment, everything is where it should be, and that feels like a kind of peace. The scribes begin arriving in earnest now, shuffling in with bundles of paper, prepared inks, and an impressive variety of reed pens. You watch as they settle into their assigned spaces, a silent choreography perfected over countless mornings. Each has a particular style, a preferred nib, a favorite angle for holding the pen. Some hum quietly as they work, the notes soft enough to feel like part of the room's ambient rhythm. You nod approvingly, already anticipating the low murmur of scratching pens, the faint rustle of pages, and the occasional cough that breaks just long enough to remind you all that humans are still present. A mainstream historical fact emerges naturally: copyists in Abbasid libraries are highly trained, often beginning apprenticeship in childhood and spending years mastering calligraphy and accuracy. Their role is crucial, because a single miscopied numeral in an astronomical table can throw calculations wildly off. Historians still argue whether training practices were standardized across the city, or if they varied significantly depending on the patron or the scribe's teacher. You've seen evidence of both, often in the same room. You move among the scribes, supervising with a light touch. You adjust a slanted pen, offer a tip about ink thickness, and occasionally whisper a gentle warning about keeping edges clean. One scribe, overly eager, nearly spills ink on a recently returned manuscript. You sigh softly and hand him a scrap sheet to practice, muttering that the real world rewards patience, not speed. He chuckles sheepishly, and the small human moment dissolves as he returns to careful work. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. Some scribes, when bored or frustrated, leave tiny doodles in the margins, cats reading books, camels in scholarly robes, or abstract squiggles that only make sense to them. You found them in texts you're cataloging, and they add a faint warmth to otherwise serious work. You smile at one particularly creative corner showing a figure balancing a stack of scrolls on its head. Even centuries ago, librarians needed reminders that humor has its place. The room settles into a gentle hum. Lines of ink form slowly across paper, each stroke deliberate. You check the manuscripts brought in for copying today. Some are long mathematical treatises, others delicate poetry, and a few exotic translations arriving from the far reaches of Persia or India. Each manuscript demands slightly different attention, and you adjust accordingly, guiding hands and eyes. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly. Scribes often specialize in genres because handling unfamiliar content increases the likelihood of mistakes. Historians still argue whether specialization fostered greater intellectual diversity or simply created silos in knowledge circulation. You glance at a table where a younger scribe struggles with a particularly intricate table of astronomical calculations. You kneel slightly, showing him a subtle adjustment in pen pressure and ink flow. The numbers straighten and the arcs align. He nods appreciatively. There's a quiet satisfaction in this kind of teaching, a soft, almost invisible thread that connects knowledge across generations. Occasionally, you whisper reminders about page orientation, line spacing, or ink drying time. Some scribes grumble softly, but mostly they understand. Errors at this stage have long-term consequences. You've had the grim pleasure of correcting a copy where one misplaced word turned a medical recipe into a mildly alarming recipe for dessert. The historian in you smiles faintly at the thought, knowing someone, someday, will wonder whether ancient chefs were experimenting in ways no one expected. As mid-morning light spreads through the windows, shadows lengthen across the desks. You walk deliberately, making sure all hands are steady, all manuscripts secure. The room hums along with a gentle rhythm, nibs moving, pages turning, soft scribbles, and quiet hums. You notice the faint scent of ink, paper, and human breath mingling together, oddly comforting. A light joke crosses your mind. This is your version of a symphony, albeit one where the percussion section occasionally sneezes. You pause near a young scribe copying a medical text. The marginal notes are fascinating, remedies for headaches, observations on sleep, even a note warning against eating too much garlic before public readings. You smile quietly, remembering your own body's reactions to meals and naps. Scholars centuries later will debate the efficacy of these treatments, and you suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle. Historians still argue about whether these marginalia were taken seriously or merely tolerated as personal quirks. The room continues in its soft cadence. You feel the satisfaction of steady productivity, the pleasure of supervising work that is quiet, deliberate, and infinitely patient. Each scribe contributes to the living body of knowledge, and you are the steady heartbeat that keeps it coherent. You take a slow breath, resting momentarily against a shelf, listening to the harmonious hum of human endeavor. As the scribes settle into their work, your attention drifts toward the translators, a quieter but no less vital presence. You can hear their voices just above the hum of writing, murmuring softly in languages that sometimes feel musical and other times like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, even fragments of Coptic occasionally slip through the conversations. You pause for a moment to let the sounds sink in, aware that these are ideas traveling across both space and time, reshaped by language but preserved in essence. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind naturally. Abbasid scholars actively sponsor translations of scientific, philosophical, and literary texts from multiple cultures, creating one of the most intellectually diverse environments in history. Historians still argue whether this translation movement was primarily motivated by curiosity, statecraft, or religious education. You have your own quiet opinion. It's a little of all three, spiced with the occasional human vanity. You move closer to a small group gathered around a recently arrived Greek manuscript. They read aloud, pausing frequently to consider the best Arabic equivalent for certain terms. Words like logos or cosmos stretch and flex, and arguments quietly ripple through the group. You listen, nodding occasionally, reminding yourself that even centuries later, scholars will still debate what accurate translation truly means. A light joke flits across your mind. The first translator to ever say this is exactly right probably got laughed out of the room. A quirky tidbit emerges as you glance over a translator's shoulder. One of them has written a tiny comment in the margin in the form of a limerick, teasing another scholar about the difficulties of rendering poetic meter into Arabic. The humor is subtle, almost invisible unless you're paying close attention. You smile faintly. These little moments humanize the laborious work, reminding you that even the most erudite minds crave small joys. You pause to make a note in your catalog book. Marginalia, scribbled in different hands and languages, sometimes adds layers of meaning or confusion. You jot a question mark beside a particular annotation, noting its linguistic origin and possible significance. Later, someone may consult your note to untangle the web. Historians still argue whether catalogers like you unintentionally influenced future interpretations of texts through such small observations. The translators continue their soft debates, occasionally consulting diagrams or numerical tables. One scholar gestures toward a mathematical formula, and a light discussion ensues about whether the original Greek intent aligns with the new interpretation. You recognize the familiar patterns. A phrase is analyzed, a word is questioned, an idea is measured, and then life goes on. Translation is a conversation across centuries, and you are the quiet witness. You move along the side of the room, observing how others cross-reference texts. A Persian historian quotes a Sanskrit astronomer while consulting a Greek mathematician, all without leaving the room. You pause, admiring the complexity. It is simultaneously exhausting and inspiring. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly. Abbasid scholars are known for synthesizing knowledge across cultures, often producing commentaries that integrate multiple intellectual traditions. Historians still argue how original these syntheses are versus how much they reflect careful compilation, but from your seat, it doesn't matter, the work is undeniably impressive. You pause near a small wooden table where an assistant is organizing notes from a translator's session. Some of the sheets are delicate, edges slightly worn, but you handle them with practiced care. A quirky tidbit catches your eye. The assistant has drawn tiny sketches of constellations alongside numerical annotations, a habit picked up from Indian astronomy texts. You suppress a grin, thinking that centuries later, someone will study these sketches and marvel at the imagination tucked into technical work. A light joke drifts through your mind as you glance across the room. If anyone tries to measure productivity here by volume alone, they will underestimate creativity by an entire universe. Each translation, each cross-cultural discussion, is a bridge spanning time and geography. You feel a quiet pride in witnessing it, knowing that even your role, cataloging, overseeing, guiding, is essential to the bridge holding together. You step back, letting the translators debate softly. Their voices rise and fall, not in anger, but in curiosity, in the gentle tug of understanding something perfectly unfamiliar. You make a mental note to revisit a few particularly knotty passages later. Patience is part of the process, and you have more than enough. The room hums in contented scholarly energy, a living organism sustained by curiosity, skill, and meticulous attention. You pause, inhale the faint mix of ink, paper, and concentrated thought, and settle into your own rhythm, ready for whatever questions, errors, or insights the day might quietly deliver. Midday arrives gradually, not with a bell or drum, but with the subtle shift in light and the way the room itself seems to pause. The sun has climbed high enough to warm the outer walls, casting long, softened shadows across the floor. You notice the faint scent of herbs carried in from a nearby courtyard, reminding you that someone, somewhere, has been tending to plants meant for food, medicine, or simply pleasant fragrance. You set down your pen and take a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of the morning's labor ease slightly from your shoulders. A mainstream historical fact gently settles into your mind: daily prayers punctuate the day for scholars in Abbasid Baghdad, providing structured pauses that encourage both reflection and focus. You rise from your low chair and step into a quiet corner, performing the ritual ablutions and prayer with calm precision. Historians still argue how strictly individuals adhered to these schedules versus adjusting them for study or work, but for you, the act itself offers a welcome rhythm. After prayers, you sit in the shade of a small courtyard, the noise of the city outside softened into a gentle hum. You unwrap a piece of flatbread and nibble slowly, mindful of crumbs near the precious manuscripts back inside. There's honey, thick and slightly crystallized, which sticks pleasantly to your fingers. You remember yesterday's lesson about accidental ink stains versus honey stains, and smile at how even small choices carry consequences in your world. A quirky tidbit drifts in: some scholars keep tiny cloths specifically for wiping fingers when snacking near texts, while others rely on prayerful self-discipline. You wonder which method produces fewer arguments later. You glance around the courtyard. Students occasionally pass through, carrying loose pages or pausing for a whispered conversation. Some scribes retreat here briefly, stretching tired fingers or adjusting their posture. You notice one young translator gazing skyward, sketching a pattern of clouds alongside marginal notes. You think how easily such a small act could be dismissed as idle, yet it's often in these moments that insight occurs. A light joke flits through your mind: apparently even the heavens are consulted for proofreading. Water laps softly in a nearby fountain, its cadence steady and unremarkable, a perfect background for contemplation. You dip your hand in, enjoying the cool contrast to the sun-warmed stone. Another mainstream historical fact: access to running water in public and private spaces is a hallmark of Baghdad's urban design, supporting hygiene, comfort, and scholarly routines. Historians still debate whether this access was as equitable as some sources suggest, but for someone like you, it's a small, consistent blessing. You return to the library, refreshed but not fully alert, easing back into the rhythm of the room. You pause briefly to admire a stack of recently completed manuscripts, each one a testament to patience and precision. Copyists nod at you silently, recognizing your glance as approval, and you feel that subtle, mutual satisfaction that comes from work done well. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some manuscripts arrive at the House of Wisdom slightly scented with sandalwood or rosewater, gifts from patrons hoping to inspire favorable treatment or simply to add an aromatic flourish to their knowledge. You inhale faintly, amused at how even ancient scholars appreciated ambience. The rest of the midday continues in a predictable, comforting pattern. Pens scratch, pages turn, translations are debated softly in corners, and you move deliberately among it all. A mainstream historical fact: breaks for prayer and meals are not simply religious obligations but practical interventions, helping prevent fatigue and errors among those working with delicate texts. Historians still argue how faithfully these routines were observed, but in your library, they serve as markers, gentle punctuation for concentrated labor. A light joke crosses your thoughts: if someone suggests that the life of a librarian is boring, remind them that every minor decision here, ink thickness, paper placement, shadow management, can ripple through centuries. You chuckle softly to yourself, knowing this is a secret no one outside the room fully appreciates. As you settle back into your chair, the room hums around you, a quiet symphony of human thought. Fingers glide across paper, eyes trace lines carefully, whispers of debate drift like smoke. The day has reached a gentle plateau, neither rushed nor stagnant, simply a sustained focus on preserving and interpreting the world's knowledge. You feel content, aware that this pause, midday, prayer, bread, shade, is not idle time, but essential breathing space in the rhythm of learning. After the brief respite, you return fully to your duties, feeling the room settle back into a steady rhythm. The scribes are immersed in copying, their heads bowed, nibs moving in meticulous, near hypnotic lines. You take a slow, careful walk among them, adjusting a page here, pointing out a faint ink smudge there, all with the quiet authority earned over years of experience. A mainstream historical fact: precision is paramount, particularly in scientific or mathematical texts where a single misplaced numeral could render an entire table useless. Historians still argue whether such mistakes were common or merely exaggerated by later chroniclers, but you know firsthand the care that every conscientious scribe must take. You pause beside a translator working on a philosophical treatise from Greek to Arabic. Their brow furrows in concentration as they debate a single word choice with a colleague, the air filled with the soft murmur of reasoning. You recall that marginalia often includes personal commentary, jokes, or even scolding notes, left for future readers who will likely be baffled or amused. A quirky tidbit: one scholar once added a small drawing of a frustrated owl, perched on a pile of scrolls, to express his own confusion about the text. You smile faintly, appreciating the understated humor amidst intellectual labor. Light streams in unevenly through high windows, illuminating particles of dust that drift lazily, catching your attention and grounding you in the quiet present. You walk to a shelf of recently catalogued medical texts, brushing your fingers lightly over the spines. A mainstream historical fact: Abbasid medical knowledge is extensive, with physicians compiling encyclopedias on diseases, treatments, and hygiene practices, some of which predate similar European compilations by centuries. Historians still argue about how accessible these texts were to laypeople versus scholars, but you are more concerned with ensuring their preservation and correct placement. A gentle murmur reaches you from a corner where a scribe copies a collection of poetry. The rhythm is slightly different here, more lyrical, less methodical, yet no less precise. You admire the flexibility of the scribes: some excel in mathematics, others in literature, each adjusting to the demands of the text. A light joke forms in your mind: if poetry could be measured in ink splatters, this room would be an art gallery. You chuckle softly to yourself, careful not to disturb the delicate silence. You approach a table stacked with astronomical charts. One of the assistants is meticulously redrawing celestial positions, using subtle shading and ink gradients to indicate constellations. You pause to admire the skill, noting a quirky tidbit: some of these charts contain annotations suggesting that stars influence health and daily life, a curious mix of observation and superstition. Historians still argue how seriously such beliefs were taken, but the charts themselves are undeniably precise and beautiful. A fresh breeze drifts through a slightly open window, carrying scents of baking bread, heated stone, and distant gardens. You breathe deeply, allowing the small sensory pleasures to anchor you amid the meticulous work. The room hums, a living organism powered by patience, focus, and careful repetition. You glance at a scribe whose hand is trembling slightly and remind them, softly, to rest their wrist every so often. Even the smallest adjustments prevent fatigue, mistakes, or worse, long-term injury. A mainstream historical fact asserts itself again: Abbasid scholars value incremental progress, often working in cycles that balance intense focus with small restorative breaks. Historians still argue how strictly these cycles were followed, but the rhythm of the room itself seems to enforce them naturally. You make a mental note to encourage tea or water for the copyists in an hour, a small act that keeps everyone steady. You turn back to your personal desk and review your own notes, scanning yesterday's observations against today's progress. The process feels almost meditative. Each adjustment, each careful placement, each gentle correction contributes to a long-term project of intellectual continuity. A quirky tidbit: some scribes add a tiny note at the bottom of pages reading "Check tomorrow," a simple acknowledgement of the never-ending nature of careful scholarship. You smile faintly, appreciating the human humility in such annotations. The afternoon light softens, painting long shadows across the floor. You feel a slow satisfaction in the continuity of work, in the calm cadence of a day spent preserving and expanding knowledge. Each sound, each motion, each faint scent is part of the subtle music of the library. A light joke drifts through your mind: the pen may be mightier than the sword, but only if it's held correctly and fed the right ink. With the scribes engaged, the translators deep in their murmured debates, and your own duties steadily unfolding, the library continues its quiet, vital existence. You take a final, slow look around, the faint smell of paper, ink, and human diligence comforting in its constancy. The day is progressing as it should, steady, gentle, and meaningful. As the afternoon deepens, you feel the subtle shift in energy throughout the library. The earlier morning fervor has settled into a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The scribes and translators work with the kind of focus that only comes after hours of warming up, their movements precise, almost automatic. You glide between desks, observing, adjusting, and occasionally whispering guidance where needed. A mainstream historical fact: in Abbasid libraries, afternoons often mark the most productive hours, as the initial morning formalities and midday meals have passed, allowing the mind to concentrate fully. Historians still debate whether this pattern was universally observed or simply a convenient coincidence for a few diligent individuals. You pause by a young scribe who has become slightly frustrated with a tricky poetic passage. The words seem to refuse alignment, the ink blotting slightly as he presses too hard. You kneel to suggest a subtle shift in technique, noting the angle of his wrist and the flow of his pen. He adjusts carefully, and the lines straighten almost magically. A quirky tidbit: some scribes secretly practice their calligraphy on scrap sheets while walking to the library, believing that movement enhances fluidity. You suppress a smile at the thought of someone balancing ink pots while navigating crowded streets. The translation team is debating terminology once more, this time over a philosophical text that references celestial bodies in metaphoric terms. Greek, Arabic, and Persian concepts clash and merge on the pages. You watch silently, occasionally nodding or offering a gentle suggestion on phrasing. A mainstream historical fact: translators in Baghdad often wrestled with abstract concepts that had no direct equivalent in Arabic, resulting in creative coinages that enriched the language. Historians still argue how much these innovations were standardized or remained idiosyncratic. You marvel quietly at the subtle power of words. A light joke drifts through your thoughts: if the stars could see the debates about their own positions, they might roll their celestial eyes. The room is thick with concentration, the only sound the soft scratching of pens, the rustle of paper, and murmured clarifications. Even the occasional cough or shifting of a stool blends into the ambient rhythm. You realize that this consistency, this invisible infrastructure of diligence, is as much a part of the library's function as the texts themselves. You move toward a shelf of medical manuscripts, carefully checking the order of texts. One scroll seems slightly out of place, perhaps moved inadvertently by a copyist in the morning rush. You slide it back gently, noting in your catalog that minor rearrangements were made. A quirky tidbit: some medical manuscripts are annotated with personal observations, warnings, or remedies tailored to the scribe's own experience. These notes, while not authoritative, give future readers fascinating insight into the daily life of a practitioner. Nearby, a translator pauses to compare two versions of a Greek treatise, murmuring over a particularly ambiguous line. You watch as they weigh options, considering subtle connotations and potential misinterpretations. The room remains silent enough for thought to travel unimpeded, yet alive with energy. A mainstream historical fact: collaborative translation and commentary was a hallmark of the Abbasid scholarly tradition, producing texts that combined multiple perspectives. Historians still argue how much collaboration influenced the original meaning, but from where you sit, the process seems almost sacred. You pause for a moment, leaning against a shelf. The smell of paper, ink, and faintly worn wood fills the air, grounding you. A light joke flits through your mind: if anyone describes this room as quiet, remind them that the loudest sound here is intellectual curiosity. Even the softest whisper of thought has its resonance. You smile faintly, appreciating the subtle, living hum of knowledge in motion. A student quietly approaches, seeking advice on finding a specific astronomical table. You provide guidance without interrupting your own flow, pointing to the correct shelf and marking the reference in your catalog. Small acts like this are surprisingly satisfying, small bridges between order and chaos. You notice a few scribes glance over with curiosity, the momentary human interaction adding warmth to the disciplined environment. As shadows lengthen, you feel the slow shift toward the day's next phase. Afternoon work continues in steady cadence, each hand, eye, and thought moving in gentle synchrony. You breathe slowly, letting your presence merge with the rhythm. This is the subtle heartbeat of the library, meticulous, continuous, patient, and alive. As the afternoon stretches toward early evening, you notice the subtle dimming of light through the high windows. The sun, no longer directly overhead, casts softer, elongated shadows across desks and shelves, painting the room with a muted golden glow. It is the perfect time for reflection and review. You move deliberately through the space, checking manuscripts, observing scribes, and occasionally offering a quiet suggestion. A mainstream historical fact: many Abbasid libraries operated on a near-continuous schedule, with scholars and scribes working from dawn until dusk, pausing only briefly for prayer and meals. Historians still argue whether this uninterrupted schedule was ideal or contributed to fatigue-induced mistakes, but you find a gradual transition of light calming rather than disruptive. You pause at a translation table where a small group debates subtle distinctions in terminology. Greek words describing the heavens, when translated into Arabic, require delicate judgment. You watch their silent gestures and whispered clarifications, marveling at the elegance of intellectual negotiation. A quirky tidbit: sometimes translators would write tiny mnemonic poems in margins to remember particularly tricky passages, almost like hidden treasure for future readers. You smile faintly, thinking that one day, someone will stumble across these poetic aids and feel the delight you've already appreciated. A light joke drifts through your mind: if celestial bodies could comment on their own translations, they might find the whole endeavor unnecessarily dramatic. Yet, observing the careful deliberation, you recognize that precision matters. Even the smallest misstep could ripple through generations of scholarship. You adjust a carefully stacked manuscript, realigning pages that have shifted slightly under human touch, mindful of how subtle errors can accumulate over time. Moving along, you check a shelf containing astronomical diagrams and charts. The tables of planetary movements are dense, inked with painstaking attention to detail. A mainstream historical fact fits naturally: Abbasid astronomers meticulously recorded celestial positions, creating tables used for navigation, astrology, and religious calendars. Historians still debate how much their observations relied on direct measurements versus earlier sources, but the mathematical rigor is undeniable. You pause, tracing a line of numbers with your finger, appreciating the precision required to maintain coherence across texts. Nearby, a scribe struggles with a particularly intricate poetic manuscript. The lines demand uniformity, symmetry, and a steady hand. You kneel briefly, demonstrating a subtle technique to maintain rhythm and balance in lettering. He imitates, breathing slightly easier, and returns to work. A quirky tidbit: some scribes secretly include playful flourishes or tiny drawings in corners of manuscripts, almost invisible unless closely inspected. You spot a faint crescent moon tucked between lines of poetry and suppress a chuckle. Even the most disciplined scholars find small outlets for whimsy. The room hums with concentrated activity: pens scratch, paper turns, translators whisper, and your own movements create a gentle rhythm. A light joke forms in your mind: if anyone claims librarians lead dull lives, remind them that the quietest rooms often contain the most intricate dramas. You continue walking among the desks, pausing to straighten a pen, nudge a paper into alignment, or softly remind a scribe about ink consistency. Small gestures ripple outward, sustaining the library's quiet equilibrium. You move to your personal work area, reviewing notes and cross-references. Each entry, correction, or annotation you make is part of a larger, ongoing project. Scholars centuries from now may consult these catalogs, unaware of the subtle decisions and careful hands that ensured accuracy. A mainstream historical fact: meticulous record-keeping is a hallmark of Abbasid scholarship, ensuring continuity across generations. Historians still argue how complete surviving records truly are, but for you, the act itself preserves a sense of order and intention. As shadows deepen and the library settles into a softer ambience, you take a moment to breathe, inhaling the gentle mixture of ink, parchment, and human diligence. The day is shifted, but the pulse of learning continues steadily. Every small correction, annotation, and careful stroke contributes to the enduring life of knowledge, a subtle, ongoing legacy that stretches beyond immediate perception. As the light outside softens further, conversations in the library grow slightly more cautious. This is the hour when ideas are still flowing, but everyone becomes more aware of who might overhear them. You feel it in the way voices drop and glances linger a fraction longer than necessary. Knowledge in Abbasid Baghdad is powerful, and power always carries a delicate relationship with politics. You move toward a shelf reserved for texts commissioned by wealthy patrons and court officials. These manuscripts are often beautifully copied, sometimes excessively so, as if elegance itself might protect the ideas inside. A mainstream historical fact settles into your thoughts: much of Abbasid scholarship is funded through patronage, particularly by caliphs, viziers, and elite families who view learning as both prestige and political capital. Historians still argue whether this patronage encouraged free inquiry or quietly shaped which ideas were safest to preserve. You inspect a newly arrived manuscript commissioned by a court physician. The text is harmless enough on the surface, focused on diet and seasonal health, but its margins contain pointed commentary about excess and restraint. You hesitate before shelving it, aware that interpretation depends on context. You decide on a neutral placement, neither hiding it nor showcasing it. Librarianship, you've learned, often involves choosing the least dramatic option. A quirky tidbit drifts through your mind: some scholars deliberately couch controversial ideas in poetic metaphors or medical analogies, hoping to slide past scrutiny unnoticed. You've seen philosophical arguments disguised as discussions of digestion or sleep. You smile faintly. Even here, metaphor is a survival skill. A translator approaches you quietly, asking whether a particular passage should be included verbatim or softened slightly for circulation. You listen, considering not just accuracy, but consequence. You answer carefully, suggesting that faithful translation matters, but so does thoughtful commentary. Footnotes, after all, are where caution often lives. A light joke flickers through your mind: if truth were loud, libraries would be much noisier places. You glance toward a section of shelves where certain texts are consulted only under supervision. Not forbidden, exactly, just sensitive. Political theory, unorthodox philosophy, histories of past dynasties that did not end well. A mainstream historical fact fits here: while the Abbasid world is relatively tolerant of diverse ideas, censorship does exist, often informal and situational rather than systematic. Historians still argue how strict these boundaries were and how often they were enforced. From your experience, the rules are flexible but memorable. You make a quiet note in your catalog, using neutral language. The phrasing matters. Too vague and it's useless, too specific and it draws attention. You've developed a style that says just enough to guide a careful reader. You wonder briefly if future historians will read between your lines and reconstruct the tensions of your time. You suspect they will, and you hope they're gentle about it. Across the room, a scribe pauses, rubbing his temples. You suggest a short break, reminding him that tired hands make dangerous mistakes. He smiles gratefully and steps away for water. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some scholars believe mental exhaustion invites intellectual error in the same way physical fatigue invites illness. You're not sure where that theory comes from, but it feels correct. As evening approaches, the library's atmosphere shifts again, becoming quieter, more inward. The urgency of the court fades slightly, replaced by the steady responsibility of preservation. You feel a familiar calm return. Politics may shape which books arrive and how they're discussed, but your task remains constant: to care for what exists. You take a slow walk through the aisles, fingers brushing lightly against wooden shelves. Knowledge survives not just through bold ideas, but through cautious stewardship. You breathe out softly, content in the quiet balance you help maintain. The lamps are lit now, one by one, small islands of amber glow spreading gently across the library. Evening doesn't arrive all at once, it seeps in, like ink slowly soaking into paper. You feel it in your shoulders, in the careful slowness of your steps, and in the way conversation fades into respectful murmurs. This is the hour when the library exhales. You begin the familiar ritual of closing. Not abrupt, not ceremonial, just deliberate. A mainstream historical fact settles naturally into your thoughts: Abbasid libraries often remained open later than marketplaces, but they still followed the rhythms of daylight, lamplight, and human endurance. Historians still argue whether extended evening hours were common practice or reserved for special scholarly gatherings, but tonight feels ordinary in the best way. You move from table to table, gently reminding scribes to finish their lines and mark their places. Reed pens are cleaned, ink pots sealed, and unfinished pages carefully weighted so they won't curl overnight. A quirky tidbit crosses your mind: some librarians swear that manuscripts left unsecured develop misalignments overnight, as if the texts themselves wander when unattended. You don't quite believe it, but you still double-check the weights, just in case the books have ambitions. A light joke drifts lazily through your thoughts: if knowledge could walk, this place would need sandals at the door. You suppress a smile as you straighten a stack of folios, aligning edges until they rest neatly together, calm and cooperative. You pause at the manuscript chests, heavy wooden boxes reinforced with iron fittings. Each one is a small vault of time. You run your hand along the grain of the wood before locking them, listening to the soft, reassuring click. A mainstream historical fact fits here easily: many valuable texts are stored in chests rather than on open shelves, protecting them from dust, moisture, and wandering hands. Historians still debate how many works were lost despite these precautions, but tonight, everything feels secure. The translators gather their notes, rolling scraps of paper into neat bundles. You remind one of them to store reference glossaries separately, knowing how easily they disappear. He thanks you, joking that without librarians, translators would still be arguing with themselves. You quietly agree. Even solitude needs structure. As you move through the final aisle, you notice marginal notes added earlier in the day. Nothing alarming, just thoughtful commentary, careful questions, and the occasional polite disagreement. You make a mental note to review them tomorrow. The library doesn't sleep, exactly, it pauses, holding its breath until morning. Outside the windows, the city has softened. Sounds from the street are fewer now, more distant, like the memory of noise rather than noise itself. You extinguish one lamp, then another, leaving just enough light to guide your steps. A quirky tidbit floats back to you. Some scholars believe knowledge settles better in dim light, as if ideas prefer shadows. You don't know if that's true, but the calm is undeniable. At last, you stand near the entrance, looking back over the room. The desks are orderly, the shelves patient, the manuscripts resting. You feel a quiet satisfaction, not pride exactly, but steadiness. You lock the doors, careful and unhurried, and step into the cooling evening air. Tomorrow will bring questions, debates, and delicate decisions. For now, the library is at peace, and so are you. You walk home beneath a sky that is fully surrendered to night, the last warmth of the day still lingering in the stones beneath your sandals. Baghdad hums softly around you now, no longer bustling, just breathing. Oil lamps flicker in doorways, and somewhere nearby, a late meal is being prepared, the scent of bread and herbs drifting lazily through the air. You let your pace slow, because there's nowhere you need to rush to anymore. A mainstream historical fact settles gently into your thoughts. Abbasid cities like Baghdad were deliberately designed to support scholarly life, with neighborhoods, markets, mosques, and libraries woven tightly together. Historians still argue whether this closeness was intentional urban planning or simply practical evolution, but either way, it means your work never feels far from the rest of life. Knowledge isn't hidden on a distant hill, it walks the same streets you do. You think back over the day. The careful translations. The quiet political balancing. The crescent moon doodle hiding in a manuscript margin. A light joke drifts through your mind. If future generations judge your era by its scribes' doodles, you hope they conclude everyone was very tired but generally good-natured. You smile to yourself and adjust the strap of your bag. At home, you wash the ink from your fingers, watching the dark water swirl briefly before disappearing. There's something comforting about that, the way effort leaves a trace, then fades. A quirky tidbit returns to you. Some scholars believe repeated exposure to ink strengthens memory, as if ideas travel through the skin as much as the mind. You're not convinced, but after a lifetime of this work, the thought feels flattering. You sit, stretching your legs, and allow silence to settle. Tomorrow will bring more cataloging, more decisions, more whispers of debate. Historians still argue whether the House of Wisdom truly functioned as a single institution or a loose network of scholars and libraries. From where you stand, labels matter less than the rhythm. The day worked. The books are safe. That's enough. Your breathing slows. The city sounds blur into a distant, steady hush. Lamps dim. Thoughts stretch out, growing softer at the edges. And now, gently, the pace changes. There is nothing left to organize. Nothing left to decide. The shelves exist without your attention for a few hours, resting the way you will. You picture manuscripts lying flat and calm, ink cooling, pages untroubled. You imagine tomorrow arriving slowly, with lights slipping through windows again, unhurried. For now, you let yourself drift. Your body is heavy in a good way. Your thoughts loosen, one by one, like knots patiently undone. The world feels steady, ordered enough, quiet enough. You've done your part today, and that is sufficient. Stay here in this softness. Let the day dissolve. Let the night hold what remains. Sleep comes not as an interruption, but as a continuation, another careful act of preservation.